do you see the changes that has happened in Europe considering foreign policy after the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Well, you see, foreign policy is always decided by the elites. It doesn't play much of a role in elections, and the masses of population, when they demonstrate, for example, as they've done in France about the retirement age, they hardly ever demonstrate about foreign policy. When we bombed or helped the US bomb Libya, there was essentially no reaction, and even the so-called left was to a large extent supportive of the bombing, even though it occurred after the catastrophe of the Iraq War. And then when the Syrian events occurred, they also supported it. Afghanistan, the same story, they were lukewarm about it. But so, in fact, the funny thing is that during the Cold War, although I think the Soviet threat was vastly exaggerated, you could say that it existed in principle, and therefore some Europeans needed what we call the American umbrella, nuclear umbrella. I mean, de Gaulle in France wanted to get rid of it and have his own umbrella, but Germany could not, so they felt that they had to be protected by the Americans. But the funny thing is that, funny is not funny, the tragic thing is that when the Soviet Union collapsed and even the threat, the largely imaginary threat from the Soviet Union disappeared, then our elites became even more American and more following the Americans. You see, that's a funny thing. There was some reaction in 2003 during the Gulf War, but there was no opposition to the Kosovo War in 1999. There was, as I said, no opposition to both the Libyan War. There was very little opposition to the Afghanistan War. There was no opposition whatsoever to enlargement of NATO. That went along with the enlargement of the EU. The enlargement of the EU was completely contrary to the spirit of the EU, because the spirit of the EU was, of course, to put together economies that were somewhat comparable. Even Italy was a little bit behind, but at least France, Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany were at that time, similar. But then they enlarged it to countries vastly very different development levels. And of course, that was also due to the fact that we had to help those countries that were under communist Russia or Soviet domination and so on and so forth. I mean, in my view, it has been an unmitigated disaster. But Europe, you see, the European construction has become a religion in the sense that it's very, very difficult to criticize it. I mean, if you really ask people concrete questions, like for example, there was a referendum in 2005 in France and in Holland. It was rejected by a majority of people about the European Constitution. Then, of course, Sarkozy, they did the same thing in Holland. He got it voted, more or less the same text by the parliaments, the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies, and totally contradictory to the will of the people expressed by the referendum. The referendum was like 55 to 45, so it was pretty clear the rejection of this treaty. And this treaty, of course, strengthened there was already the Maastricht Treaty. The Maastricht Treaty was voted because part of the left voted for it because the far right voted against it. So stupidly enough, they didn't care what the content was. I mean, it seems to me that, if you really were to discuss it, for example, the pension reform now, it actually does come from the European Union. It is a directive from the European Union. But hardly anybody, people say, Macron, okay, Macron execute what the European Union wants, but if they were in power, they would probably do the same thing. They wouldn't have much choice. And that's a problem that nobody discuss it, but when it's discussed, when you mention that to people, then they don't like it. Then if you say you're happy that you are not sovereign anymore, no, but they don't realize it because it's never discussed. You see, that's the problem. And so the European, now, of course, with the war in Ukraine, we'll see where it goes, but of course they have taken these sanctions. The sanctions hurt our economies much more than the Russian economy. And van der Leyen, who's the president, sort of the dictator of the European Union, who was elected by nobody, was liked by nobody. She was hated in Germany when she was Minister of Defense. Then she was sent to Europe, how can I say, to get rid of her. And then now she's making all these decisions and nobody wants them, but there's nothing we can do about it.
But you see that when you talk about the war in Libya, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, these wars were not affected Europe that much because immigration affected, yeah, pouring people into Europe, it was affected a lot Europe, but economically it didn't much affect Europe. But how do you see it? Because Russia is something so different from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from Libya.
Of course.
It's next door. It's something. It's Europe. It's not far from Europe. And when they decided to arm Ukraine instead of negotiate, and we if we remember the Minsk one and Minsk two, Francois Hollande and Angela Merkel, they were bragging recently. They were bragging that they were buying time for Ukraine to build up its military.
Yeah,
It's
I
not.
know, I know, I know.
I
They,
Yeah.
yeah, but you see, this was never discussed, wasn't even discussed in Parliament. It was just a decision of the executive power. So you see, the problem of foreign policy is that people get, I mean, the Vietnam War wasn't decided by the American people. Once they were dragged into it, of course, many people became patriotic, etc. In this situation, it's not so clear. There is a 24/7 bombardment of news, pro-Ukrainian news in our media, but I don't think there's a great enthusiasm. But there is not opposition either, because you see, if you are opposed, if you're critical, and you're a Putin-Versteher, as they say in German, a Putin understander, and it's very, I mean, Germany is very repressed. In France, a little less, but still you are completely marginalized. You have no access to media or anything like that if you are considered a Putinist, as they call it. So it's difficult.
But is there any fear in Europe? Are they afraid of Russia? Because you recently Finland joined NATO, and we know that Finland survived Cold War without any problem. And
No,
Russia is not Soviet Union. Russia is not that much powerful like Soviet Union. How Finland? I want to understand the logic behind the decisions of Finland. For example, for
I
instance,
worked a lot. I worked very often as a physicist. I worked very often in Finland, and you see in all those countries, the Baltic state, Poland, Ukraine, Finland, and of course Germany, but Germany is a bit different. There is really a racial hatred or contempt for the Russians. After all, the Russians did control or colonize Finland to some extent, but they were pretty liberal, but they were, they didn't suppress the language or anything. But the control between 1812, when Russia took Finland from Sweden, till 1917. In fact, ironically, it's Lenin who declared Finland independent. Actually, it was in December 1917. But nevertheless, you see, during the Cold War, there was the process called Finlandization. Actually, from Finnish point of view, it was a good thing. They were not allowed to be as pro-Western as they might have wanted to, but they were reasonably free. They could trade with Russia. They were more industrialized, so it was an advantage, the usual trading relation between industrialized countries and less industrialized countries. So it was a good situation, but they resented it. Also, they'd been lost. They were on the side of Germany during the war. It was complicated, but they were, and then they lost the war. And I think there is a resentment, and the resentment is expressed now because at the time of the Soviet Union, it would have been too dangerous to be openly anti-Soviet. And now it becomes supposedly, acceptable to be anti-Russian, especially because Russia is the big bad guy who's invaded Ukraine, blah, blah, blah. So you can hate Russians for that reason more openly than you could during the Cold War. It's precisely because Russia is not as strong as the Soviet Union. It's not as scary, and then people like to attack it. But I think it's still stronger than it would. It's not as strong as it used to be, but still it's strong enough so that it would be wise not to attack it. But I don't think anything will happen to Finland, by the way, unless there is an all-out war. But that would be the same thing for Belgium. I mean, for my country, it would be, it would be a disaster. But I think the Russians are actually very careful. But it all depends how it turns out, of course, because the NATO wants to give more and more weapons to Ukraine, and they want a new offensive, and I don't know how that's going to turn out, but the Russians are not going to give up Crimea easily, to put it mildly. So I think the situation is completely crazy, but the mentality of our elite is completely crazy. You see, they won the Cold War, free market won, so there's, there is the end of history for them, and the people who resist are authoritarian. I mean, they call authoritarian regimes which are perfectly democratic, like in fact Russia itself, but certainly Hungary. I mean, Orban, whether you like it or not, wins election, or or Erdogan won elections. I mean, you may not like it, but they win elections. So, and they're open, and they're, at least the counting is fair, and I mean, you can't. I mean, yeah. I mean, I view it as a sort of ideological falling. But on the other hand, of course, since the topic was nationalism in Europe, there is a rebirth of nationalism against the European Union. I don't like, I mean, there are two aspects in it. You see, nationalism can be either defensive or offensive. In the third world, it was in the decolonization process, also in the anti-fascist struggle during the war, etc. It was largely defensive, the Soviet Union, okay. But then, of course, it can be aggressive also, like German militarism, Japanese militarism, American imperialism is extremely aggressive, despite what they may say. And then there are these two aspects. And in Europe, for the moment, of course, you can't say it's very aggressive, but it can be. I mean, there is a European nationalism which is aggressive with respect to China, Russia, etc. China hasn't done anything to us. Taiwan, why should I care about Taiwan? I mean, it's not none of our business. But you see, there's been this European sentiment. We are going to go get rid of the nationalism of the past that led to so many wars in Europe and such disaster, etc. But then they create their own nationalism, and then we have to bring, democracy to Libya. We have to bring democracy to Syria. We have to bring democracy to China, etc., etc., which is their own militarism, if you wish, under the guise of. I mean, it's also interesting to see that the worst people, the worst people from that point of view, are the Greens, and especially the German Greens. And German Greens used to be very anti-nationalist, and they still are against German nationalism, but they're against, I mean, a form of German nationalism which would be traditional, but of course it's human rights, nationalism, and women's rights, etc. So in the name of those ideologies, then they justify an aggressive position of the United States, of Germany. The most extraordinary thing is the foreign minister of Germany, Baerbock, went to Saudi Arabia, and she warned Saudi Arabia against normalizing relations with Syria. Can you imagine that? They say, no, don't normalize with Syria before Assad makes concession. First of all, it's none of their business. And then, of course, why do you rely on Saudi Arabia to implement human rights in Syria? It looks a bit ridiculous when you see the status of women in the two countries. And then finally, there is no way that the human rights situation can improve in Syria if there is no peace. And the major factor of war is, of course, the support of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and so on for the jihadists in Syria. So the only reasonable thing to do would be to have peace in Syria, and that's what the Saudis are doing now under the influence of the Chinese. And the Germans come in, the German Green come in, no, don't. It's utmost absurd. But that's what they have become. What used to be the left, which used to be for peaceful coexistence, which was to be anti-imperialist, etc. Now they're totally aligned. They're sometimes even worse than the Americans. It's unbelievable. But against, I wanted to come to nationalism. Against that, of course, there is a nationalist sentiment which is rising. But instead of having a sort of, you see, it is defensive nationalism in some sense, but it's carried by the far right. I don't think the far right now is partly aggressive, but it is focused on immigration. Of course, I think the European Union is strange because on the one hand, all the elites, all the intellectual elites, all the academics, all the politicians, etc., are in favor of them, almost all journalists. And then there is this far right and part of the left who is unhappy about it. The left is unhappy about the economic policies, but they don't know what to do about it. And the right is mostly focusing on immigration. So I don't think the situation is very good, because even though I think immigration is a serious problem, I would rather have people focus on independence of Europe with respect to the United States. And that the left doesn't do it. As I said, they're completely human rights, so we have to intervene everywhere and in fact follow the United States. And the right, as I say, sometimes they speak about that, sometimes not.
The security of Europe is dependent on Russian energy. It's not something to be ignored. I don't know how they're all going for Ukraine gonna win, Ukraine go. But how about the security of Europe? How about the people of Europe? How we don't hear anything about the Germans, French, Belgians, people of different nation states. We can know that what a country as Uganda think about the war in Ukraine. But we don't know what German thinks, what French thinks about these.
No, they are bombarded with the propaganda that we have to make Ukraine win, otherwise Russia will conquer, Putin will conquer the world. They have, they have used all the years of the Trump administration to Russiagate, which is a complete fabrication, in order to, excite people against Putin. He has put Trump in power, and it's awful, etc. I don't really like Trump, but I don't see why he was worse, at least from our point of view, than any of the others, or including Biden, of course. So we are really in a very strange situation. And as I say, to me, it's ideological, because they don't have much interest in this war. I mean, if, of course, they could win and partition Russia and then loot it as they did in the 1990s, that would be, of course, economically sensible. But, of course, I don't think many people seriously hope to do that. So in the end, I think it's really, something which people should. It's ideological more than rational from an economic point of view. And then, of course, the problem is that then once it's a sort of ideology, it's a sort of a religion, it's very difficult to object to it. Even the German capitalists don't object so much to it. What do? They delocalize to the United States or to China or something like that, where energy is cheaper, and the government doesn't do anything to it. And it's sort of it's really truly amazing. I mean, I've been very depressed since the beginning of the special military operation, not only because, of course, the war in itself is something very sad, but also because the reactions of the Europeans and the lack of defense of their interests on the side of the Europeans is really absolutely bewildering.
When I was talking with Paul, we were talking about Macron when he went to visit China recently. He said that France is not American vassal. But what Paul pointed out, it doesn't change the reality. It is. They don't decide their foreign policy. United States decide for them what's going to be their foreign policy. They don't decide about their own foreign policy.
A few years ago, Macron said that NATO was brain dead, and that shocked people. And now he said, no, it has been revived by an electroshock from Putin. It's not true. I mean, NATO is just a way for the US to control Europe, and it used to be like that, and it's still like that.
When this war started, you remember there was a debate between John Mearsheimer and Sikorsky from Poland. In that debate, Sikorsky was insisting that this war is Putin's war. Putin won this war. But recently he changed his policy. He said, no, this is a Russian war because all the Russians are killing Ukrainian. But you see, if Putin goes away, we have Medvedev. He's far more aggressive than Putin. You cannot ignore, you cannot put aside a nation as big as Russia, as rich as Russia, and you said by just a rhetoric, this is just Putinizing Russia. How do you say this?
Yeah, I don't know what to say about it. I mean, it seems to me the main problem for me is, of course, the lack of implementation of the Minsk agreement, and behind that, the fact that when there was the coup in 2014, which was a coup because you can't have an elected president like Yanukovych who has to flee for his life. I mean, you can't call that anything else but a coup. You may be for the coup, you may think that Yanukovych was corrupt or whatever you may think, but nevertheless, it was a coup. And then, of course, the people in the East did not agree with that. In Bakhmut, for example, there were mass demonstrations against the coup right after the coup. I mean, now, of course, it has been destroyed through the war, but the people there were not happy with the coup. And there was, in Mariupol, there was a vote, and there was like 84% of people were against the coup in Kiev. I mean, it would have been so easy and so sensible to negotiate with the people of the East and say, what do you want? You want to be part of Russia? You want to be independent? You want to be autonomous inside Ukraine? There are many formulas, and there are states like Spain, for example. I don't know about the federal state in Brazil, but in Spain, you know, the Basque Country, Catalonia, and so on, they want to be independent, but they are, for all practical purpose, very independent. They control their own taxes and so on. It's the same thing in Belgium. So you could have many, you know, you can, and there, for example, in Catalonia, the language is Catalan. The official language is Catalan. They don't even have. I don't think they're Castilian, regular Spanish as a possibility. And in Belgium, it's the same thing. There are regions where it's Flemish, Dutch, Jewish, and other is French. I mean, you could have that in Ukraine, that you could have region where people speak Russian, and Russian is the official language, and it would be a solution. I mean, it's so obvious, and Switzerland's an example. It's so obvious that there are these solutions all over the world, but the Ukrainians, for reasons that have to do with the Western Ukrainians, their own fanatism, and hatred of Russia, including the Russians in their territory. Okay, if they hate Russia abroad, that's a different question. But they hate the Russians in their territory. And why are they Russian in their territory? That's the most absurd thing of all, because I mean, all these liberals and warmongers and Americans they insist that the people who have been put in Ukraine arbitrarily in 1922 by the Bolsheviks, and Crimea, which has been attached to Ukraine by Khrushchev under communist rule, and who have had never any word to say. Nobody has asked them what they wanted, either then or now. And they have to be part of Ukraine, and you can't discuss the border of Ukraine, but Ukraine has a right to secede from Soviet Union. That was sacred. The same thing in Yugoslavia. Croatia had a right to secede from Yugoslavia, but what about the Serbs in Croatia? No, they have no right. Now we have the same problem in Kosovo. Kosovo had a right to secede from Serbia. It was part of Serbia. No, but what about the Serbs in Kosovo? No. They have no right whatsoever. I mean, the way the policy of the so-called right of autonomy or free of independence of people has been abused by the great power is just, again, flabbergasting, and hardly anybody says anything about it.
And you talk about the immigration, the problem that Europe has right now. It's totally because of the Europe's policy, foreign policy in those wars. Syrians, Iraqis, Afghanis, those were
It's American.
they,
Let's say it's American. These are American wars that we have been going along with, but they are not our wars. I don't think, for example, without the United States, I think it would have been very difficult to attack Libya, because the Americans destroyed all the, the anti-ballistic defense. I mean, the anti-aircraft and so on defense of Libya the first night, and then the Europeans could go there and bomb. But otherwise, I'm not sure they would have liked to do that. I mean, Europe is still not very warm. I mean, the country which is really warmongerish in the West is the United States, and to some extent Britain. But the continental Europe, yeah, now they get very excited with the sanctions and send weapons, etc. But before they send troops, and in Libya and Syria, it was the same thing. They use jihadists, and they use... Yeah, it's absolutely terrible. But I think the main issue for me, and which I hope the situation might evolve, if the situation goes bad in Ukraine for the Americans, for the West, then it might provoke a reaction in Europe where people will finally say, why do we have to be subjugated to the United States so many years after the war, and even so many years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Why do we have to remain, subject to the United States? After all, in Latin America has been basically a semi-colony of the United States for ages, but I can see everywhere in Latin America, people want to be independent of the United States. Not everybody, but you know very well that there is a trend, and that trend, I think, is a positive thing. And of course, it's even more true in the Middle East, but that's a separate question. But in Europe, there is nobody. I mean, people. No, you're Putinist. You're Putinist.
It's all about Putin. It's something like this guy. If this guy disappears from Earth,
Yeah.
all the things, all the problems would be solved. It's not. It's not. It's not true.
But during World War One, of course, World War Two was different. Hitler was different, but World War One, all the propaganda was that it was all the fault of the Kaiser, the German Kaiser. And so what happened at the end of the war? Well, he went in exile in Holland and he lived the rest of his life there. That's all. And nothing. I mean, there was no. Of course, after the war, the German war criminals were hanged at Nuremberg and so on. It was a different situation, but the World War One was really personalized around the Kaiser, and was not, of course, again only him. It was his generals, everything else. So I think Russia. I think anyway, the point about Russia is that even if you say now it's not Putin, but it's the Russian, and we have to hate the Russians as a people, which they also do, it always ignores the basic question of what happened in 2014 and even before. And if you look at the votes, for example, in Ukraine, before, systematically since it became independent and they had these votes, in Eastern Ukraine, they always voted for so-called pro-Russian candidates. Yanukovych was one, of course, but then even Poroshenko was one, and even, the present president was voting.
Zelensky. Yeah.
Zelensky was in favor of peace and negotiations. So you get elected on this basis, and then they do exact opposite, and he was doing the exact opposite way before the invasion. So it's very,
It's so amazing when you see what happened in Ukraine. They didn't want to negotiate with Russia in December 2021. Putin sent two letters to NATO headquarters and Biden administration asking for negotiation and building up on Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. Why they refused to do that.
Yeah, I know.
Now, after killing a lot of Ukrainians, spending a lot of money, putting in risk Europe's security.
Because I think they think they're stronger than the rest of the world. But you see, one thing which there's always been, at least since Kissinger, the policy of the West during the Cold War was to separate Russia and China. And now what they have done is to put Russia and China together. You might say Russia is weaker than the Soviet Union. That's true, but China is far stronger than it used to be. So putting the two together, and of course having then the BRICS around them, and then more and more countries want to join the BRICS all over the world, in Africa, in Asia, in South America, and so on. So there are people who have good relations with Russia. Even I must say, been surprised, because obviously from the strict point of view of the international law, the special military operation, as they said, the invasion of Ukraine was illegal and it has been condemned, but the people have not taken sanctions, and people think there should be negotiation and so on and so forth. So most leaders of most countries, I mean, not most, but many, don't apply the sanctions, and they want negotiation. So, which I think will be the end. The end game will be negotiation of some sort. I don't think Russia will be totally defeated and the whole of Ukraine liberated, which would be a catastrophe, by the way, from a humanitarian point of view, because they would do what the Croats did with the Serbs in Croatia, namely expel the Serbs, and they were maybe a few 100,000, but now we're talking about millions of people who will be repressed if the Ukrainians manages to invade or retake what they've lost, the part of Russia the part of Ukraine that they have lost to Russia. But I don't think that that's very likely, and so eventually there will have to be a negotiation. Because it will depend on the relationship of force at the time when they finally accept negotiation. But it would be very easy. I mean, Musk, for example, Elon Musk, he He said, why don't we organize referenda on a local basis to see what people want to do? The Russians did it, but you could say, okay, maybe it was fake, so let's do it honestly with international supervisor, etc., from the UN. And then, of course, the Russians may not have accepted that, but even before Musk had finished a sentence, they were already jumping on him, saying, no, Ukraine is territorial integrity of Ukraine, you can't discuss these things, etc. Well, many European countries are, as I say, Switzerland, Belgium, Spain, all these countries have a large degree of regional autonomy because there are different people, and in Ukraine there are different people, so why not? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, even from the point of view of their so-called values.
Yeah, but when we look at this war in Ukraine, the negotiations, it seems to me so difficult because there is no trust because of those agreements that they were cheating. They were literally cheating on
Yeah,
France
now,
and Germany because United States was not involved in in those negotiations, but Germany and France were cheating in those agreements. How is how but and the on the other side, Ukraine is Zelensky is saying that Ukraine will not negotiate until it gets all the territory lost to
I
Russia.
know, I know. The only real negotiation, which would have to be secret, of course, in the beginning, would have to be between Russia and the United States. Because without Western support, Ukraine collapses in a few weeks. So, and the Western support depends entirely on the United States. So, that's the bottom line. Okay, that you have to get the.
But do you think is there any trust between the United
Ah,
States and Russia? Of course not.
oh, no, 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 no. There is no trust whatsoever. But who knows if Trump gets elected next year? I don't know. This is a conflict which is not going to, unless one of the two collapse, either Ukraine or Russia. But for the moment, the front is really like in the First World War. It doesn't move. It moves, but not very much. So you could, maybe like in 1918, the Western Front collapsed, the German front collapsed. So if one of the two fronts collapse, then everything will change. But if it doesn't, then there has to be a negotiation between Russia and the United States. I don't see how the Biden administration could do that, but who knows? I mean, and maybe there are certainly
Because,
discussions. You could see that
but
there is discussion in the United States between the Hawks and the Doves. I mean, there is a tendency in the administration, I think partly in the Pentagon, people are more realistic and think that this war cannot be won on the terms that the Ukrainians want, so negotiations are necessary. On the other hand, of course, Nuland and of course the Secretary
Jake
of State
Sullivan, Newland, and
and
Blinken, these are the same team. These are the same team that made that coup in 2014 in Ukraine. They
right.
managed that coup.
But how many people know that in Europe? You see, that's the whole point of democracy. You see, democracy is fine, but the important decisions are usually, not always, but they are often foreign policy decisions. Maybe not so much Latin America, because Latin America, after all, is relatively war-free. It has been for a long time. I mean, without major wars, Europe has not. And so it's always the foreign policy are made by very little, very small circles. There is no discussion. There is no democracy. And then these are the decisions that affect in the end the life of people much more. I mean, for example, the sanctions against Russia affect the life even of the French people probably more than the business about the retirement age. But there's been no demonstration whatsoever, not even a discussion, not a discussion in the parliament or anything like that. That's what is paradoxical. I mean, it's not paradoxical, but that's what shows the drawback of democracy, or the fact that democracy isn't really democratic, because in democracy the important decision should be decided by informed citizenry. But of course, the citizenry is not informed and doesn't really decide anything.
You see, then when Nord Stream pipeline, the sabotage of Nord Stream pipeline occurred, I was thinking, you see, right now, Europe, is there any other is there any other country that can provide Europe with cheap energy as Russia?
No, they buy it. They buy Russian oil through India, as far as I understand, and also buy it in Azerbaijan and in the Gulf, and then they buy it from the Americans. And I don't know how they are doing, because obviously they do have shortcuts. I'm not sure exactly how much. I mean, because the winter was mild and so on, but this problem will continue for several years. And since they have destroyed their nuclear
If
energy,
not decades.
yeah, if not decades, yeah. So I don't know how that's going to evolve, but I mean, also the Nord Stream, okay? Look, first of all, they say it's the Russian. That was completely absurd, because the Russian could just turn the tap at the beginning of and that was it, without destroying their investment. Then, of course, there was this suggestion by Seymour Hersh that it's the Americans, and then everybody jumped on him and said, no, 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 it's not true, etc. In fact, this is by far the most plausible. Now they say 6 guys in a boat, and they're Ukrainians, etc. But then if they're Ukrainians, then you could say it's not very kind to the Germans who are giving all these weapons to Ukraine. Why don't the Germans protest against that? They don't dare. And why isn't there an inquiry? That's the whole thing, because the Swedes I think the Swedes have done their inquiry and have not revealed the conclusions. Seems so obvious. That's the Americans, and they know it, they don't want to say it. They're afraid to say. That shows we are a colony to the extreme, and maybe worse, maybe than even Latin America in the worst period of Latin America. I mean, just unbelievable. Because, ultimately it's a self-imposed, I mean, the Americans have intervened militarily in Latin America. I don't have to tell you how many times, but I don't even know how many times. But in Europe, it's not the case. I mean, they are. It's all through their foundation, to the money, to their think tank, and the corruption of people who go to American universities and so on and so forth. But the effect of that is just amazing. And our continent is really going to suffer a lot from that.
Yeah, when I saw just last week, I saw the inflation in European countries compared to BRICS, compared to Brazil. Here we are living here, but it's and comparing to Russia, it's these sanctions are
Oh,
affecting much more European countries than Russia.
of course, I think that they did not expect. Huh? They overestimated their strength. They thought that, I mean, the Minister of Finance in France, Bruno Le Maire, he said, we're going to crush the Russian economy, and Macron said the ruble is in free fall, and they thought they were going to stop the war very quickly by crushing Russia and provoking regime change there. But that was a total misunderstanding both of the Russian mentality and of the relationship of strength, and the fact that the Russians have prepared themselves, and since 2014 they have had sanctions, and so they have reoriented, for example, their agriculture became more productive, etc., etc. So it really, completely.
And we see this new Putin as an Erdogan from Turkey. They're talking about this new the Turkish stream between Russia and Turkey. Maybe Turkey we gonna provide energy to Europe, but you see, anyway you get it from Turkey, if you get it from India, it's gonna be much higher than you get it directly from Russia.
Of course, of
And
course.
the European have to pay this.
Sure, but I think the Germans tend to overestimate their strength. Huh? They overestimated it during both world wars. I mean, they obviously thought they were going to win, and they lost in both cases. But obviously, they were. I mean, in the first one, they were obviously certain they would win. And the second, of course, when they attacked the Soviet Union, they thought they would win. I mean, I think there is some problem in the mentality there of being Übermenschen. You see, superior people, and they probably thought they would crush Russia. That there's a lot. As I said, I noticed that in Eastern Europe there is a lot of a mixture of hatred and contempt for Russians, like Asians, and of course also for Chinese, but it's really not so pretty. I mean, they all cover it up by speaking of human rights and blah, 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 and feminism and gay rights and so on, but when you go to the bottom of it, there is really a lot of hatred and contempt for Russians. But you
You,
may
you
hate them,
know, you know when we
but we should not despise them. I mean, they have ways to defend themselves.
you see, to some extent, we see the Nazism in this cancel culture that came out. They want to cancel
Yeah,
everything that is not happy with that.
yeah, that's true. That's true. The cancel culture is a little bit different, but it's true that the idea of canceling just, I mean, okay, they haven't done it totally, but they have, on many occasions, of course, cancelled people in the sports, cancelled people in the arts, and music, Tchaikovsky, and God knows what. I mean, that is really something extraordinary because, okay, it happened during the war, for example, but then we were at war with Germany. I mean, we are not, or, you know, but we are not, or with Japan, but we are not at war with Russia. I mean, Ukraine is not, it's not an ally, it's not part of NATO. It's not, okay, there is a conflict there. Maybe if you think Putin is very bad, then it's not a war. The same way the war in Yemen by Saudi Arabia was absolutely atrocious, but nobody thought it was a war. And the conflict in between India and Pakistan is not a war, and in the Kashmir is not a war. I mean, or in Sudan. I mean, why does it become a war, and why do we have to so passionate about hating everything Russians? It's, yeah, and as I say, it's really very, very strange, a very strange psychological phenomenon. Now, to what extent does it affect ordinary people? That I don't know. Propaganda has always some effect, but there is no indication of a very big, popular sentiment in this war. I think people are mostly indifferent to it. But if you ask them, they will probably repeat what they hear on TV, more or less. But it's the media, in the media, the blitzkrieg, the propaganda is just unbelievable.
You see, then after in 1991, in 1992, February 1992, this Wolfowitz doctrine came out right after the collapse of Soviet Union, right after that unipolar world. You see, one of these objectives of this doctrine was to denationalize European
Yeah,
countries. That's just to destroy nation states.
yeah.
As someone who's living in Europe, how do you see, could they could they achieve their objectives?
But I think the dream of the Europeans back in the 30s, the European construction, is really to make France similar to Massachusetts and Germany similar to Texas and so on. Have really the United Nations of Europe similar to the US. Because a very big difference is that the US started as a nation state with the 13 states, and then they expanded. And of course, they always were English speaking, and they always impose English. Now there is a bit of Spanish, but mostly they've imposed English everywhere. While here, the languages are different, and they're not going to disappear. In Belgium, for example, Belgium, there's Dutch and French, but of course, in the beginning, they tried to impose French, but it didn't work. So we're not going to impose any language on Europe, and if Britain is not part of Europe, then English is even a foreign language, except in Malta. So we are all communicating in English, even though it's hardly any European country speaks English. And it's just so artificial. I've been working in many European countries. I've been working in Sweden, in Finland, Germany, in Switzerland, in Italy, in France, and of course in Belgium. And I've been working, temporarily as a scientist, and I can see that these countries are different, and they are not getting closer. If you have soccer game, for example, the different countries will be, the citizens of different countries will be very nationalistic about their own country. Well, of course, in South America also, but it's not that the national sentiment has disappeared. It's just that the decision-making center have been moved to this European bureaucracy. And the European Union there's been no move towards a genuine union of the European people. And in fact, L'Europe des Nations, Europe of Nations, De Gaulle was thinking about would have been, is, and it would still be a better idea, but that's not what they want. They want to raise the nations. And of course, they raise the nation in three ways. One is the defense, it's through NATO, American domination. Then you have the European construction, that's for all the political, economic policies and so on. that is, delegated to experts, and then there is immigration. Immigration, of course, is a third way to destroy nations, because if you create too much immigration, then you create different communities, like we have in Belgium actually, and then the communities are in conflict with each other, and what do? You see, if people don't have a national sentiment, then of course it's difficult to have a united policy or a united anything. So that's the way the nation state, they're trying to make it disappear. Now, whether it will succeed or not, I don't know. As I said, there is relative indifference to the first two chapters, namely NATO and economic policy. There is no indifference. There is less and less indifference to immigration there. I think if there was a referendum or a poll, you would find huge majorities in favor of blocking immigration, even maybe more than is reasonable. So Macron said he was willing to make a referendum on anything except immigration, because if he did immigration, it would be like 80% against him. So that's really the Achilles, heel of the European construction. Not that I like it, but that's the way it is. And I don't know how that's going to develop, but clearly that's the main way that the European Union is being contested nowadays. But of course, there are also people who don't realize that the European Union actually dictates the immigration policy. I mean, countries are not allowed to do what they want.
But where does it come from? Where does it come from? This policy that European Union dictates. It's come from European Union, or it comes from United States?
No, that's from European, the unification, the fact that they want to transfer decision making to the European bureaucracy. I mean, all the treaties have done that. So, for example, I don't know if it's Amsterdam or Lisbon. I mean, one of these treaties really says that immigration policy depends on the must be handled at the European level, not at the French level or Belgian level, etc. And that's why they decide that they will take refugees or migrants and disseminate them all over Europe. Then the Hungarians say, no, we don't want. The Poles say, no, we don't want. But I think in France and Belgium, etc., if people were free to say something, they would say, no, we don't want. But there isn't much. That's going to be the main issue in the next few years, this issue of immigration. The same way it is for the United States, by the way. And I'm sure if Paul was here, he would agree with me that there is especially since I guess he comes from the South, there is a huge reaction in the United States against immigration through the southern border. I mean, not that as I say, it's not something I like, this reaction, but it's unavoidable, and it's something which has to be, which people have to face and handle properly.
You see, when for instance, in Italy, Meloni got elected. You see, there is no difference in changing these far right, far left politicians. The final decision, I don't know, some internal policy gonna change, but the foreign policy didn't change. I didn't notice any change in foreign policy of Italy.
I don't think she changed very much the immigration policy either. From what I've seen, nothing has changed. Italy is in a very difficult situation because they are, very heavily indebted, so they depend very much on the European Union, and so they are for money, and then they can't do what they want. And since as I said, the immigration policy is determined by the European Union, so
and we see that the President of the United States has an important role on the foreign policy of the EU. That's obvious. And how do you see this election that coming in the United States in 2024? We have two candidates. We have Donald Trump. He's leading Joe Biden. He's leading the Republican Party. I don't know if he's going to be elected or not. If they're going to let him participate in this process, this is a big question. On the other hand, we have RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He's he's making a lot of sense because he's talking about Ukraine, he's talking about U.S. foreign policy. He's a lot of reasonable point he's making right now. How do you see this? How Let's talk about the RFK Jr. Do you see any chance for him in United States in Democratic Party?
No, of the three, if you say Biden, him, and Trump, I prefer him on the whole. Not everything, but I prefer him on the whole. Yeah, he says things that make a lot of sense. But so did Sanders to some extent, maybe not so much on foreign policy, but he did say things, and he was eliminated by the Democratic Party machine. The Democratic Party machine, I think, is much more efficient than the KGB in eliminating opponents. Of course, it may be less brutal, but it's very, very efficient because you have the media campaign, then they may find something, maybe they find some sex business or something or other. No, look at what they did with Sanders. They decided that he was racist and sexist. I mean, there is no trace of that. Okay, this pure
Unbelievable.
but they say he's anti-black, he doesn't have black, and so on. And so Biden and Clinton were absolutely awful, and they've been awful in their policy and so on. They suddenly declared by some black priest or something like that as being pro-black. What's the evidence for that? I mean, of course, all the economic measures proposed by Sanders would have been vastly in favor of blacks, maybe not directly, but indirectly. And they decided he was, well, it's, they call him, what do they call him? Sanders brothers, I mean, meaning that it's all a men's club and a white man and all white men and so, but the others are white also, they also, except Clinton is a woman, but, it's completely ridiculous. They did the same thing in Britain with Corbyn. I mean, they destroyed him by saying he's anti-Semitic. There is no trace of that. He's totally anti-racist. He has been demonstrating against apartheid when England had very good relations with apartheid and so on. But they've been able to destroy him. What do they find with RFK Jr.? I don't know. We'll see. But for the moment, it's not too high in the polls. So maybe they don't also. They have ways to manipulate the primaries, and they've already decided they're going to start the primaries in the South rather than in Iowa and New Hampshire, because that's the way it does usually. I mean, you can ask Paul Craig Roberts, I'm sure he's going to tell you that the Democrats have lots of tricks. And in the general election, I myself have no position on whether the 2020 elections were, cheated in the usual way. I mean, in the sense of counting the votes, but they were certainly cheated in the sense of the laptop, the Hunter Biden laptop, which they say, oh, it's Russian disinformation, blah, blah, blah. In fact, it's not true. And I just read this afternoon that now they have put the content of the laptop on the website. I haven't checked that, but if it's true, then of course everybody's going to look at these gruesome pictures of Hunter Biden being drugged and maybe sex with minors. I mean, they seem to be absolutely horrible pictures there. And whether that's going to affect the election, the next election, I don't know, but it would certainly have affected the 2020 election if it had been better known. And of course, when the New York Post published that, they completely suppressed it, called it Russian disinformation. So again, it was the fault of Putin. I mean, it's ridiculous. Anyway, that may make it a little bit open. I mean, the Democrats, if Hunter Biden makes his further compromise, because of course the father is linked to the son in various business deals, if it makes him compromise, then the Democrats, if they're clever, may think that RFK is a better choice to beat Trump than Biden. But I don't know. That would be the only chance for RFK. But if they decide to eliminate RFK, I think they will manage to do it.
But the problem, if you remember when Bernie Sanders was running against Hillary, he was talking about Syria, why the United States is still in Syria. He was criticizing Israel policies.
Yeah.
He made a lot of sense in those days, but right now you see when you get part of those inner circle policymaker in the United States, he's totally in in line with Biden foreign policy toward Russia. You see?
Yeah, of course. Israel issue in Israel, in the US, but also in Europe, increasingly, is a real joke because, for example, RFK had praised, Roger Waters for his views on Ukraine, but then now that Roger Waters is also labeled anti-Semitic because of his concert in Germany or whatever, then RFK has deleted his tweet and he said, well, it's really almost unbelievable how the Israel, because I think Paul Craig Roberts agrees with me that it's due to the action of the pro-Israel lobby and not to any interest of the United States. But the pro-Israel lobby is so efficient and so vicious and so on that everybody is afraid of them and capitulate in front of them. And that's the one thing which, of course, would be the case, of course, with RFK. I mean, he's probably not very enthusiastic for Israel, but he wouldn't dare to say that. And probably is wise not to say that because then he would be dead.
If you see just the final question, if you see the DeSantis was criticizing the war in Ukraine. DeSantis is Republican. He was criticizing the war in Ukraine. The other day he said, "No, I was wrong. We have to support Ukraine. You have to send equipment. You have to send weapons to Ukraine." You see these flip-flopping, this changing their policies day by day. It's not anything. The only one that I see in this race in the United States is Trump. That is, it's so. He's saying that in 24 hours he's gonna end this war in Ukraine.
Yeah, but that's not true. Huh?
Yeah, that's not true. But you see, if you stop sending weapons to Ukraine, how this war gonna continue?
No, that's true. But whether he would dare to do that, I don't know. But but DeSantis is the worst because DeSantis is even more fanatically anti-Chinese. He wants to war with China, so it's even worse. Okay, apart from RFK, I don't see any of them. And of course, even RFK is weak on some points, but that's better than nothing. But I think they will eliminate him. As I say, the only chance is that if Biden does very badly in the polls versus Trump, then the Democratic establishment might think that RFK is a better horse than Biden against Trump. Now, whether it's true or not, that I don't know, because once RFK is facing Trump, Trump has his own means to attack him, so I don't know what that would do. But who knows? That would be actually, I think that might be a clever move by the Democrats, but for the moment I don't see it, and the machine is so overwhelmingly in favor of Biden. You see the New York Times, the Washington Post, all these things are very much pro-Biden and anti-RFK, so I don't see. Okay?
Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. It was a great pleasure to have you on here.
Yeah.